Today, it is a bastion of counterculture, coffee, and bridges, a city that prides itself on being distinct, weird, and fiercely independent. It is a metropolis of steel spanning the Willamette River, where glass towers reflect the gray majesty of the Pacific Northwest sky. But rewind the clock 2 centuries, and you would find no bridges here. You would find no coffee shops, no bicycles, and no city. You would find only a dense, formidable wall of Douglas firs, trees as wide as houses and as tall as cathedrals, looming over a muddy riverbank. This was not a likely place for a civilization. It was a dark, wet wilderness known to the indigenous Chinookan peoples for its resources, but dismissed by many early explorers as an impenetrable thicket. Through this journey, we will hack through the underbrush of history to witness the birth of the City of Roses. We will see how a trivial coin toss determined its name, how a stump town built on mud became a global port, and how the darker undercurrents of the waterfront created one of the most notorious reputations in the American West. This is the story of Portland, Oregon in the 1800s. The coin flip and the clearing, 1843-1845. The story of Portland's founding is one of the most famous accidents in American history. In the early 1840s, the land was known simply as the clearing, a small break in the timber roughly 12 miles downstream from the established settlement of Oregon City. It was a rest stop for weary travelers on the river, but 2 men saw something more in the mud. Asa Lovejoy, a lawyer from Massachusetts, and Francis Pettigrove, a merchant from Maine, filed a claim for 640 acres of this waterfront land in 1845. They had a vision, a port city that could rival the settlements further inland. But they had a problem: they couldn't agree on a name. Lovejoy wanted to honor his home of Boston, Massachusetts. Pettigrove dreamed of a new Portland named after the primary port of Maine. They didn't fight a duel, they didn't go to court. They settled it in the parlor of a log cabin with a simple copper penny. It was a best 2 out of 3 toss. Pettigrove won the first, Lovejoy won the second. The destiny of the Pacific Northwest hung on the third spin. The coin landed and Pettigrove's Portland was born. Had the penny rolled differently, we would be telling the history of Boston, Oregon today. But naming the city was the easy part. Building it was a brutal war against nature. Stump Town and the Gold Rush Windfall, 1846-1855. A name on a map does not make a city. In the late 1840s, Portland was a muddy mess. The Douglas firs that covered the land were so massive that clearing them was a Herculean task. The settlers would cut the trees, but often leave the stumps behind because removing the roots was too labor-intensive. These stumps remained in the middle of the makeshift streets for years. Pedestrians had to hop from stump to avoid sinking into the river of mud that served as a road. Locals whitewashed the stumps so drunks wouldn't crash into them at night. It earned the young city its first unglamorous nickname, Stump Town. However, geography was on Portland's side. Unlike Oregon City upstream, Portland had deep water right at its banks, allowing ocean-going vessels to dock. This advantage became a gold mine literally in 1848. When gold was discovered in California, San Francisco exploded in population, but they had no infrastructure. They needed lumber to build houses and wheat to feed miners. Portland, with its deep water and endless forests, became San Francisco's supply closet. The Stump Town economy ignited. Timber and grain flowed south, gold dust flowed north. This influx of California gold allowed Portlanders to finally pull those stumps, pave their streets with wooden planks, and transform from a campsite into a commercial hub. The mud was slowly being covered by the veneer of civilization. The steamship monopoly, 1860s. By the 1860s, the chaos of the frontier was giving way to the order of the tycoon. The key to the region's wealth was the Columbia River, the great highway to the interior where gold was being mined in Idaho and Montana. But the river was treacherous, blocked by massive cascades and rapids. Enter the Oregon Steam Navigation Company, OSNC. A group of Portland businessmen realized that if they controlled the portages, the small rail lines that carried goods around the rapids, they controlled the entire economy of the Northwest. They formed a ruthless monopoly. If you wanted to ship gold, wheat, or tools in or out of the interior, you paid the OSNC and you paid their price. This monopoly created a staggering concentration of wealth in Portland. While the rest of the country was tearing itself apart in the Civil War, Portland's elite were building mansions and amassing fortunes that rivaled the East Coast aristocracy. This era cemented Portland as the financial capital of the Northwest. It wasn't just a rugged port anymore. It was a city of power, where men in silk hats dictated the fate of miners and farmers from the comfort of their private clubs. The city was growing vertically as well, with the first substantial multi-story buildings rising along the waterfront, financed by the iron grip of the river barons. The Great Fire and the Iron Age, 1872-1879, hubris often invites disaster. For early Portland, the enemy was fire. The city was built almost entirely of wood, wooden buildings, wooden sidewalks, wooden wharves. In December 1872, a fire broke out on the waterfront. It was small at first, but the wind whipped it into a frenzy. It tore through the commercial district, consuming block after block. By the time it was extinguished, a significant portion of the city's heart was ash. But the wealth generated by the OSNC and the gold rush meant the city wouldn't stay down. The rebuilding effort marked a distinct architectural shift. Portland's leaders decided to rebuild not with wood, but with brick and stone, adorned with cast iron facades. This was the birth of Portland's cast iron district. These buildings were technological marvels of their time, sold as fire-resistant and modern. The iron fronts were prefabricated, often shipped around Cape Horn and bolted onto brick structures. They featured elegant Italianate designs, arches, columns, and intricate scrollwork. Portland became a city of heavy, ornate permanence. Walking down Front Street in 1875, you wouldn't see a frontier outpost. You would see a canyon of gray and black iron, a testament to a city that had decided it was here to stay. The Iron Horse arrives 1883. Despite its river wealth, Portland was isolated. To reach the East Coast, one had to take a ship to San Francisco and then a train or endure a perilous sea voyage. The city was an island in the wilderness. That changed forever in 1883. The hero, or villain, depending on who you asked, was Henry Villard. A German immigrant turned railroad tycoon, Villard seized control of the Northern Pacific Railroad and drove the line along the Columbia River towards Portland. The anticipation was electric. On September 8, 1883, the final spike was driven. The first transcontinental train rolled into the city, linking Portland directly to the Great Lakes and the Atlantic. The impact was instantaneous and explosive. The journey to the east, which once took weeks or months, now took days. Portland's population doubled, then tripled. The arrival of the railroad broke the isolation, but it also broke the monopoly of the old river barons. New money flooded in. Suburbs began to stretch across the river to the east side, connected by the first bridges. The insular, aristocratic town was forced to open its doors to the world, bringing with it a wave of immigrants, laborers, and dreamers who would reshape the city's demographic landscape. The Shanghai Tunnels and the dark waterfront, 1880s-1890s. While the railroad brought progress, the waterfront harbored a darkness that would become legendary. As a major international port, Portland needed sailors. But the life of a sailor on a grain ship bound for Europe was brutal, and volunteers were scarce. To fill the ships, a sinister industry emerged, crimping, better known as Shanghaiing. The north end of Portland became one of the most dangerous districts in the world. Boarding house masters and saloon keepers would drug or knock out unsuspecting patrons, loggers coming into town with a paycheck, cowboys, or just unlucky passers-by. These men would wake up hours later, not in a warm bed, but in the hold of a ship crossing the Columbia Bar, bound for Liverpool or Shanghai, enslaved for the duration of the voyage. Legends grew of the Shanghai Tunnels, a labyrinth of basements and passageways connecting the saloons to the waterfront, through which unconscious bodies were dragged. While historians argue about the extent of the tunnel's actual use for kidnapping, the culture of corruption was very real. Figures like Joseph Bunko Kelly became folklore villains. Kelly once famously delivered a crew of men to a captain who were actually dead bodies he'd found consuming embalming fluid in a funeral home basement, or so the grisly legend goes. This lawlessness was the shadow cast by Portland's gleaming wealth, a reminder that the city was still a rough, violent edge of the world. The Great Flood and the City of Roses, 1894-1899, as the century drew to a close, nature dealt one final, massive blow. In June 1894, the Willamette and Columbia rivers, swollen by rapid snowmelt, rose to catastrophic levels. The Great Flood turned downtown Portland into a literal Venice. The water was so high that the first floors of businesses were submerged. Yet the spirit of the city had changed. There was no panic. Instead, a strange carnival atmosphere took over. Merchants built raised wooden walkways so customers could enter the second stories of shops. Residents rowed boats down the main avenues. Hotels served dinner to guests arriving by canoe. The city, now built of brick and stone, simply waited for the waters to recede, scrubbed off the mud, and went back to business. By the late 1890s, Portland was looking toward the future. The rough edges of Stump Town were being smoothed over. The city began planting thousands of rose bushes in preparation for the upcoming Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition. The wealthy moved into the West Hills, building Victorian mansions that looked down upon the industrial smoke. The grid of the city expanded rapidly to the east side, creating the neighborhoods of bungalows and streetcars that define Portland today. As the clock struck midnight on December 31, 1899, Portland had completed a metamorphosis. In just 50 years, it had evolved from a frantic coin toss in a log cabin to a major metropolis of the Pacific Rim. It had survived the isolation of the Oregon Trail, the mud of Stump Town, the fires, the floods, and the ruthless exploitation of the waterfront. The 19th century was the crucible that forged Portland's identity. It created a city that was part refined New England transplant, part rough and tumble frontier port. The stumps were gone, buried beneath cobblestones and rails, but the spirit of that initial gamble remained. Portland entered the 20th century not as a clearing in the woods, but as the Queen City of the Northwest, ready to face wars, depressions, and revolutions. But the echoes of the 1800s, the cast iron facades, the layout of the streets, and the fierce connection to the river, remain the bones of the city we know today. Subscribe to our channel to explore more histories of the American West, and tell us in the comments, which city's origin story should we uncover next?